Bright QT. Every student matters.
Hello everyone. So let's start our next topic here. But we are going to continue with our previous topic that we have already learned. Now, here students, we are going to talk about the tribal peasants. Now, we were talking about the non-cooperation movement, right? In that, we saw how this movement, it unfolded in this process. First of all, they decided to surrender their titles. Then they decided for a total boycott of the institutions that were led by the British government, be it a school, be it a college or any professions, right? After that, when the government tried to take repressive measures, they would launch a full civil disobedience movement. Now, this is how the whole movement unfolded. Here you already have learnt about the case study that was related to what? To Awadh, correct? So, in last point, we talked about the peasants in Awadh for whom the meaning of Swaraj was quite different. Now, it was the freedom from the repressive rule or measures that were taken by whom? The landlords and the talukdars, correct? Yes. So, we learnt about that right now. Let's talk about another case study here, that is of the tribal peasants. And who were these tribal peasants and where were they from? So, we are going to talk about the tribal peasants who lived in the Guidam hills of Andhra Pradesh. Now, what was the meaning of Swaraj for these tribal peasants? We are going to understand it now. And how did it become the part of non-cooperation movement that was launched in the year 1921, right? 1920-21. So, in the Guidam hills of Andhra Pradesh, a militant guerrilla movement, it spread in the early 1920s. Yes. Now, what do we understand by this guerrilla movement? So, the guerrilla movement again is not a new term for you. When we were talking about the Indo-China group or the people cut So the term guerrilla is not new for you, right? It's not a new term here. Why? Because we already have talked about them in Indo-China, right? So here guerrilla, what does that mean, students? If you remember, I have already told you. So basically, it was an irregular warfare that was launched by a group of armed civilians, right? Involving some military tactics, right? So this was the movement that spread in the early 1920s. Where? In the Guidam hills of Andhra Pradesh, right? So the colonial government had closed large forest areas, preventing people from entering the forests to graze their cattle or to collect fuel wood or fruits. Now here we are going to talk about the tribal people, the tribal peasants. And we all know that there had been many tribal revolts in our country. Now, why did that happen? Because the British government, they decided to encroach in their traditional rights, in their customary rights or the rights that was their own as per their tradition. That was, they lived in this enclosed space, the forest hills, right? And they grazed their animals there. Correct? So we saw that how colonial government, they closed these forest regions and these cattle, they were not allowed to enter the forest or graze in these areas. So definitely these tribal peasants, they were really furious. Okay? So here we see that during all this part, when we are talking about the non-cooperation movement, right? So the tribal peasants, they stood against the government here. Correct? And the leader of these tribal peasants was Alluri Sitaram Raju. And please do not get it confused with the case of Awadh. In that the leader was Baba Ramchandra. Here the leader is Alluri Sitaram Raju, and he was an important tribal leader who claimed to have special powers. Now, what were these special powers? He could make correct astrological predictions. He could heal people, that was a miracle. He could survive the bullet shots. Now, these were some of the special powers that he inherited. Now, he was an incarnation of God. Now, people also saw him as the form of God here, right, in the form of God. Okay. So, these were some of the special powers that he claimed to have. Here, what are we seeing? How this tribal movement, it started in Andhra Pradesh. So, the British government, they had ended their isolation. Now, all these people, the tribal peasants, they were isolated in their own secluded or enclosed area. Now, the British government, they decided to end their isolation. They made tribal chiefs into zamindars and introduced new system of land revenue and taxation. Now, once these lands were the enclosed areas where tribal people they lived, it was their home. Now, they are encroaching in their enclosed areas, and also they are making the tribal chiefs as zamindars. And now new new system of land revenue and taxation was being introduced. So definitely Swaraj here for the tribal peasants was the freedom from these measures, the repressive measures that were being taken by the British government. They also tried to spread Christianity among the tribals and introduced moneylenders, traders and middlemen. Now we are seeing that religion is also playing a major role, that people were now forced to convert to Christianity, and also many moneylenders, traders and middlemen, they were coming in this region. What happened after that? The tribals, they lost their land and they were forced to become laborers, sharecroppers and rack-rented tenants. Okay? Colonialism changed their relationship with the forest. Now once they had their traditional rights in these forests of grazing their animals, right? Their customary rights, but now they could no more go there. So somehow the relationship between these tribal peasants and what they shared it with the forest that they lived in totally changed. Revenue agents forced begar on the tribals, as in they were to work as forced labor without any payment. The old agrarian system was totally disrupted. Now new taxation system was being introduced, land revenue system was being introduced. Now middlemen, traders, they were coming in these regions. So the old agrarian setup, it totally disrupted in this region. And that is how the whole scenario changed. And here when we are talking about Alluri Sitaram Raju, he was an important tribal leader here. Now he also praised about Mahatma Gandhi and was quite inspired by the non-cooperation movement. So definitely he is looking at the changes that were taking place in this region and how it had affected the lives of tribal people here. So therefore he followed the path of Mahatma Gandhi and he was inspired by this non-cooperation movement. He persuaded people to wear khadi and give up drinking. In the year 1924, Raju was executed, right? He was killed. But before that, there were some differences in his opinion. Rebels considered him as an incarnation of God, like I told you, and also how he differed from the ideology of Gandhiji, that was of Satyagrah. Unlike Gandhiji, he believed that India could become free by the use of force. So Gandhiji, he initiated this idea of truth and non-violence. But Raju, he is a follower of Gandhiji. He is inspired by Gandhiji, and also he asked people to wear khadi, give up drinking, and so on. But he definitely disagreed on one part. He believed that India can win freedom only by the use of force, right? So these were some of the views of Alluri Sitaram Raju, and the condition of the tribal people living in Andhra Pradesh, and what was the meaning of Swaraj for them. So it was the freedom from this repressive measures that were being introduced by the British government. Apart from this, let us talk about Swaraj in the plantations. Now, when we are talking about plantations, we already know one thing, students, that in plantations, the European people or the planters, they came on and invested. Why? Because they got maximized profit from these regions, right? So therefore, they were investing a lot in these plantations, growing off the cash crops, the commercial crops, right? So for plantation workers in Assam, freedom meant the right to move freely in and out of a confined space. Here we are going to take the third case study, that is of the plantation workers in Assam, right? So here there was an act that was passed in 1859. What was this act? So it was the Inland Immigration Act of 1859. Now according to this act, the plantation workers, they were not permitted to leave the tea gardens without permission, and even they were not given these the permits. Getting the permits was not easy task for them. So according to this act, what happened? The plantation workers living in the enclosed area, they were not allowed to leave that area. Correct? So during this non-cooperation movement, now when they heard about the launch of non-cooperation movement, thousands of workers, they defied the authorities, right? They denied to follow the authorities. They left the plantations and headed home. Now what are we seeing here? We are seeing that the meaning or interpretation of this word Swaraj or independence in simple terms was again different for the plantation workers in Assam. For them, according to their own situation, the term freedom, the term Swaraj here, it meant to move freely in their confined space. So basically, they wanted to go to their home whenever they wanted. But were they allowed? No, students. They were not allowed to move freely from one place to another. They had to stay in the confined space there, right? So therefore, in non-cooperation movement, they defied the authorities. They wanted to fight against this measure, and they headed for their homes. But what happened? Meanwhile, they were stranded on the way, and they were beaten up by the police when they were caught, and they never reached their home. So this is how the movement was taking place in different regions. Coming back to our exercise section, in multiple choice question, there is a question that says, the leader of the peasants in the Gwedam Hills of Andhra Pradesh was Baba Ramchandra, Venkata Raju, Alluri Sitaram Raju, or Motilal Nehru. So as we have read now, the correct answer is C. You are familiar with this name here. In very short answer question, there is a question, name the leader of the tribal movement in Andhra Pradesh. Again, if we look back to this question, Alluri Sitaram Raju. You have to write about him here. So the next question here is, in long answer questions, Discuss the tribal movement in Andhra Pradesh and its impact on nationalism. Now, here, what are we going to answer? You already have learned all these points in detail here. So, here, talk about the tribals who lived in the Gwedam Hills of Andhra Pradesh and how did this movement begin? So, basically, here we have to talk about the measures that were taken by the British government. Again, I have told you in detail here. And what were these measures? So, the regions in which the confined space or the forest areas in which the tribal peasants were living now was taken by the British government. New system, taxation system and land revenue system was introduced. Middlemen, traders, money lenders were also involved here. Now, the tribals, they had to work as begar. They were forced to work without payment and the whole scenario, it changed. The old agrarian system, it was totally disrupted, right? These are some of the points that you have to mention. And Swaraj for these tribal peasants, it meant the freedom from the oppressive measures of these British administration, right? The measures that were taken by them. And how did it impact in nationalism? So definitely large number of people, they joined this movement. Alluri Sitaram Raju, he led the movement. Military guerrilla warfare took place, right, around 1920s. So you have to write about all these points here in this question. Now, in short answer questions, there is a question: when and why was the Inland Immigration Act passed by the British in India? So, when was the Inland Immigration Act passed? We learned about it right now. It was in the year 1859. And why was it passed? So, it was passed in order to not allow the workers in plantations to leave the place. So, they were forced to live in a confined area, right? And this agitated the plantation workers there, and they now revolted against these repressive measures in the non-cooperation movement. So, this is how you have to answer this question. Now, again you have a question. In your book, it's written civil disobedience movement. But here we are talking about the plantations, the Swaraj in plantations for the workers, right? So, this happened in the non-cooperation movement, right? Just we have learnt it right now. So, here you are going to talk about the plantation workers in Assam who were forced to live in the confined space. They were not allowed to move freely. Why? Because of the Inland Immigration Act that was passed in 1859, and how this changed the life of the plantation workers who were not allowed to leave for home, right? So, how they saw the movement, the non-cooperation movement, when they heard about it, they defied the authorities and they left their job and they left for their home. But they were stranded on the way, the police got them, they were beaten up and they never reached their home. So these are some of the points that you should mention in this question here.